The Middle Ages was wrought with situations that we find appalling today. People from this time had a score of challenges and difficulties. It didn't matter if you were poor or rich, there were frightening events that affected everyone. Kings were killed by their wives, kids, or their most allegiant followers. Children died very young in most cases. Disease was rampant and incurable. Minor crimes led to hefty punishments. People were controlled by lords who owned the land, and superstition caused people to do strange things. It may be hard to understand why lack of freedom is so frightening, but this is likely because in the modern age, most of us have always been relatively free. While you might scoff at a tax bill you must pay, that's nothing compared to someone dictating who you will marry or what you'll grow in your field. In modern times, we have so much choice and freedom to do what we want. This was not the case for those living under a king or under a lord who owned the land. Old scripts reveal that around 75% of the population in the English countryside weren't free to make their own decisions. This included serfs, slaves, cotters, and boarders, who were all bound to the lord of the land they lived on. Serfdom was an actual condition during medieval times in Europe. A tenant farmer would basically be a slave to a plot of land with a landlord that was anything but kind in most cases. Most serfs cultivated a plot of land owned by a lord, which differentiated them from being a slave. There were slaves as well that were bought and sold. Serfs at least had a place to call their own. Serfs would have to give the majority of their crops to their lord. The lord could also make a serf cultivate other pieces of land that weren't their own. They worked incredibly hard and didn't have much to show for it. Additionally, serfs gave up their freedom. They weren't allowed to move around and were a permanent fixture of the land they lived on. If a serf did need to leave for some reason, they needed permission from their lord. They were often treated badly and could only escape this life by becoming a freed man or by escaping. Mutilation and torture. The means in which you would have been punished for even small crimes was frightening in the Middle Ages. There were some insane torture methods like the rat torture. Rats would be starved just for this purpose of torture, which entailed placing said rat on the victim's stomach and then covering it with a hot metal container. The rat would then eat itself into the stomach of the victim to escape the heat from the container. There was also the iron chair, which was covered in spikes. A victim would be forced to sit on the chair and they'd be restrained. The restraints would be tightened, slowly forcing the spikes to dig deeper into their bodies. This torture was a slow death, as the victims wouldn't bleed while the spikes were digging into them. They'd be alive throughout the hours or days of pain and only bleed out once the spikes were removed. The Judas cradle was a spike shaped like a pyramid. A victim would be forced to sit on this spike and it would penetrate their anus. You have to wonder how the torturer could possibly take pleasure in these methods. If the Judas cradle wasn't on the docket for the day, the punished may have had the Spanish donkey used on them. The victim would straddle a wedge-shaped board that had a pointed top. Weights would be strapped onto the feet to cause more pressure as the person was forced to sit on the pointed top. You'd have to wonder what kind of crime would have had to take place to deserve these kinds of terrible endings. Mutilation was also a popular pastime in the Middle Ages. It could be a punishment or just plain malicious. Take Wales, for example, where mutilation was a common way to prevent men from assuming titles. If there were brothers that wanted the same position or even the throne, one of them might be blinded or gelded. If you're not familiar with the word gelded, it's what they do to stallions or to middle-aged men who don't want any more kids. These types of mutilation were common in the Byzantine Empire as well. One man who had the potential to become king boldly blinded himself with a needle to avoid being murdered. Frighteningly terrible medical system. Do you experience long wait times to see your doctor? Well, count your lucky stars that it's your biggest grievance about modern medicine. In the Middle Ages, doctors were ill-equipped and lacked a lot of knowledge on how to properly treat people. There were a variety of instances where people's illnesses were vastly mismanaged. Many people died with the common medical methods in medieval Europe when their original medical problem wasn't even so bad. Take, for example, bloodletting, which was a common practice used in medieval Europe. The concept was letting the bad blood leave the body. It would even be done on certain saint days that were considered best. Sounds like they were just guessing and using superstition to try to save lives, which they miserably failed at. Bloodletting included slicing the patient up, often causing patients to bleed to death. It wasn't always easy to tell if someone was dead, strangely. To know for sure, the method of checking to see if someone was still alive was to torture them a little. This could include pulling the person's hair or pricking them with a needle. They didn't even know how to check for a heartbeat back then, perhaps, barely making it to teen years. Life was incredibly difficult, and staying alive was a challenge, especially if you followed the trends on how to keep your babies alive. The amount of children's deaths back in the Middle Ages really showcases how difficult life was. If a rat didn't cause some major health issue, you might be hung up in the air for your night of sleep. A large percentage of children died very young, whether it was from disease, famine, or bad parenting. Many babies died while their parents tried to protect them with a home remedy. Mothers would swaddle their babies and hang them from a beam in houses full of smoke from the fireplace. This was to protect them from animals and vermin. The problem was, with all the smoke rising, it would cause the babies to die from asphyxiation. The average expectancy of life was 31 years old. Children were in great danger of dying until about the age of 7. At this point, kids became strong enough to protect themselves and were more immune to the varying illnesses that often kill children, like influenza, smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis. Drinking alcohol in lieu of fresh drinking water. Not sure if people would find this frightening, but perhaps more of a delight. If you've ever seen people vacationing in Mexico, they're happy that a Corona costs less than water. It leaves them with no dilemma on what to choose. This was much the same in the Middle Ages, but for much less celebratory reasons. People didn't drink water because it was often contaminated, and you'd risk disease. If it was possible to find fresh spring water, people would drink it, but they were more inclined to drink the sensible beverage, which was alcohol. It was totally normal for people to drink a large amount of beer, cider, and wine in one sitting. It was said that a lot of people were drunk all day. Diseases had no cure. People in the Middle Ages were always concerned if someone started to cough in the neighborhood. Sure, there were more diseases around now than there were in the past. The problem was that there was no cure, unless you wanted to take your chances and see a doctor that would recommend potentially deadly solutions. When diseases came, like the Black Death, it killed nearly half of the population of Europe in the 1300s. Today, this horrendous illness could be easily cured within days by common antibiotics. A side note about the Black Death is the further deaths it caused. You see, some thought the plague was punishment from God, and thousands of Jews were murdered as a means to get back into God's good graces. Then there was the dancing plague, which caused people to start dancing continuously. The only thing that would stop the madness was a heart attack, dehydration, a stroke, or complete exhaustion. This outbreak took place in 1374 in France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Nobody knew how it began, and it stopped affecting people as quickly as it had started. Mental disorders seemed to have no real treatment. The medical system saw them as demonic possessions or a failure in someone's morals. The treatments would include exorcisms to try to get the devil out of the person's body. That, or there was torture, like whipping or drilling the person's head with the hopes that the demons would magically fly out of their body. Royalty and the difficulties they faced. Even the bravest of us loathe war, and those who long for it are the most dangerous. King Richard, heart of a lion. While it was a good living for a royal sitting on a throne, there were very few instances where they would enjoy a peaceful reign. If you look at how many kings were deposed, it's pretty clear that things weren't all roses. Henry II had some issues with his own children, who started rebellions against him. Kings would fight in battles where they needed to. For example, King John of England died of dysentery when he was fighting to regain his throne. Other kings who died in battle included Harold Godwinson, Richard III, and Richard Lionheart. Thanks for watching another show of History's Weirdest. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Cheers!